Introduce Professor Phyllis Jestice of the Department of History, College of Charleston, USA. She's a historian of medieval Europe with a particular fondness of German history of the Central Middle Ages. She's a president of the Southeastern Medieval Association, and quite inspiring monograph was published of the empresses and, in general, women of the 10th century Ottonian Germany. She's now focusing on the Crusades and studying the role of the heresies of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which is also an important factor considering the women history now, but she is now delivering the topic of the Saxonian recluses. So Phyllis, thank you, and floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and greetings from Charleston, South Carolina, and I will wish everybody a good morning, since this conference started very, very early for me this morning. And I also apologize if I stumble or misspeak. It's because I'm 6 hours earlier from you and got up very early. I would like to begin by thanking the conference organizers for their very kind invitation to take part. I had dreamed of going to Prague, but it's an imperfect world. For my paper today, I'm turning a little westward from what most people have been speaking of so far, and also to the difficult question of how non-elite people in Central Europe came to Christianity. It's given me the chance to explore a topic that has interested me for a very long time: the role of recluses, both female and male, in the Christianization of Central Europe. In particular, I wish to focus today on the vita of Saint Liutberga. Although Liutberga is the only named recluse known in Saxony before the turn of the millennium, the case can be made that reclusion was relatively common both in that region and further east, although those points are much more difficult of proof, especially in the limited time constraints of a conference paper. I will nevertheless be taking Liutberga as an example rather than as an exception, since I believe that what can be proven in her case is likely to have applied to others as well. So Liutberga was a Franconian woman. She was born in about the year 786 to a well-connected family. She was placed in a convent, but when the future saint was about 18 years old, the noble widow Gisela asked Liutberga to leave the cloister to help care for Gisela's young children and estates. Liutberga stayed with the family until sometime between 835 and 840, when she became a recluse. She spent 30 years enclosed, walled into her cell until her death. Her vita was composed within a decade of the saint's death by someone who clearly knew her personally, and there is some speculation that the author may have been a woman. So why did Liutberga become a recluse? Her hagiographer reports that the woman desired a life of penitence, and modern commentators have suggested that she may have felt guilty for having left her convent to travel about with this countess who essentially adopted her as a daughter. The hagiographer, however, does not state such a desire to cure an excessive tendency to wander with its opposite. And in fact, the hagiographer declares that when Liutberga first left the convent, it was because she had long desired a life of peregrinatio, ascetic homelessness, in the Irish model. In other words, rather than doing something for which she felt the need to atone, Liutberga may have described to her hagiographer what was already at a young age a sense of a higher calling, something certainly more active than the sedate, largely anonymous life of a nun or canoness in this era. Our author reports that Liutberga was the first recluse in Saxony, that her request to be shut up alone was, as he or she says, a form of religious life which no one in this region has yet attempted. But where would she have even heard of such a life? If at least a few hermits from the more established Christian lands had not already set up anchor-holds, cells of reclusion in Saxony. Conceivably, she might have encountered tales of recluses in the pages of Gregory of Tours, or somehow have laid hands on the canons of ecclesiastical councils, like that of Frankfurt in 794, that laid out prescriptions for a life of reclusion. We do know that she was literate, but this isn't the sort of literature likely to be found in a count's household. Yet in the Vita, Liutberga and those around her display considerable familiarity with anchoritic life. Count Bernhard, her second patron, the son of Gisela, knew enough about the proper rules for entering reclusion to suggest going to the local bishop, Theodgrim of Halberstadt. And Liutberga knew she needed to be examined by church authorities. Perhaps the source of information was the bishop himself, although in that case it is odd that the canons were not followed better. A series of synods in the 5th and early 6th century had laid out that only monastics could become recluses. Liutberga might be considered as a nun, although not an active duty one, but she certainly did not undergo the 3-year probation in a monastery before enclosure that the Trullian Council of 692 had mandated. Nor was she connected to a monastic house, nor was she under the authority of an abbot or an abbess, although Gisela's foundation of Wendhausen later tried to claim Liutberga as one of their own. Instead, Liutberga simply asked that a small cell be built for her at an unnamed place she had chosen. The site was known in the 10th century. In 956, Otto I made a grant to Quedlinburg of the cave where a certain Liutberga once was enclosed, along with the church constructed there in honor of St. Michael the Archangel, which was, by the way, about 5 kilometers away from Wendhausen. To be walled into a small cell for life at first sounds like as isolated from the world as a person can be. But when you think of it, it is also a very public life. In many ways, it's akin to the fixed asceticism of the saints of the Syrian desert, perched up on top of their pillars for anybody to gawk at who wanted to come and look at them. The recluse, once enclosed, is there for life, prohibited from ever leaving except in case of extreme need. By the 10th century, we know the office for the dead was read over her or him during the ceremony of enclosure. A number of recluses are known to have died rather than leave their cell, most famously Saint Viborata, killed in the early 10th century by Magyar raiders. They led lives of heroic virtue and self-denial once they were in their cells. Again, a good example is the next known recluse in Saxony, a woman named Sisu of Drubeck, who, according to Tietmar of Merseburg, picked up the maggots that fell from her open sores and gently reinserted them. They were, these recluses, in short, curiosities, and people came to see them in large numbers. It was recluses, far more than monks, and infinitely more than most nuns or canonesses, who followed the way of the holy men of late antiquity by teaching, mediating disputes, and serving as a bridge to God. The Vita of Liutberga makes it plain that the saint fit this model. Her cell had a little window through which she could speak to visitors, and her visitors were many. We are told that as a recluse, Liutberga fed the poor, consoled, and saw to the care of the sick and prisoners from a distance, since she could not go out herself to them. She would only have had the wherewithal to feed the poor if people were making her offerings, which she then passed on, serving as a middleman for charity. Liutberga also taught. Janet Nelson has argued cogently that the Carolingian Church was not really as misogynistic, as woman-hating, as it is often made out to be. In particular, prominent women were actually ordered by ecclesiastical councils to see to the Christian education and virtuous lives of members of their familia, a point that Jonas of Orleans also stresses in his De Institutione Laicali. Indeed, Nelson argues that the Carolingians accorded a pedagogical function to women that prefigured the distinction of Innocent III between dogmatic and moral preaching. In other words, moral teaching was not just permitted, but desirable from women of standing. Liutberga was such a mater familias, a semi-patriarchal head of family. She's specifically called a mater familias while she was still managing the household of Gisela and Bernhard. She was also a manly woman, a virago, suggesting an active rather than a passive religious life. Liutberga was an advanced student of the scriptures. Her hagiographer tells deprecatingly that if the weakness of her sex had not impeded her, she would have been able to teach others. It is clear, however, that she gave instruction to both men and women, although especially the latter. And that statement of the hagiographer has actually been taken by some as a little bit of sort of self-mockery or a little quiet, almost joke. As a recluse, Liutberga frequently had discussions with men of sanctity and learning that she was careful to assure that they left happy suggests that their conversations were at least a two-way street, rather than simply that she was taking instruction from them. Abbots and bishops commended themselves to her prayers, and a number of them visited frequently. Everyone who came to see her left filled by her with joy. The hagiographer gives pride of place to Liutberga's conversations with ecclesiastical dignitaries. But was everyone who visited the saint through her little window a good Christian, or even a Christian at all? Here we come to the crux of recluses as potential evangelists in 9th century Saxony. We are never told specifically that Liutberga converted pagans. The only woman credited in Carolingian hagiography with directly winning over the heathen is the 3rd century Verena of Zurzach, whose Vita was actually written at about the same time as Liutberga's, in about 880. But Saxony was very far from being thoroughly Christian by the time Liutberga died, although a surprising number of historians assumed that was the case. Charlemagne had, of course, converted the Saxons by fire and sword, most notably in the prescriptions of the Saxon capitularies that made refusal to be baptized a capital crime. The noble class of Saxony does indeed seem to have made a rapid and thorough conversion to the new faith, helped on their way by Charlemagne's rich gifts and advantageous marriage alliances. The author of the Vita Liutbergae actually starts the account by telling how Countess Gisela's father was one of the first Saxon nobles to submit and accept baptism, in return for which he won a noble Frankish bride likely a relative of Charlemagne's. This man, Hesse, became such a good Christian that shortly before his death, he retired to the monastery of Fulda. The emphasis on good Christian credentials is striking. For the most part, if we only had the evidence of the Vita, we would agree with the suggestion that the Saxons had settled down to be good Christians, gathering to hear recitations from HEILIGE and blithely founding religious communities. There is, however, one piece of evidence that serves to correct that image. The sequence of the Vita that leads up to Liutberga's request for permission to become a recluse starts with Count Bernhard, her patron, finding to his shock and horror that she frequently went off to churches when they were traveling, with only a single girl or boy as a companion, and stayed there all night to pray. He went to reproach her. Didn't she know that there were pagans and thieving false Christians all over the place? By the time of Liutberga's enclosure, most Saxons had probably been baptized, but that certainly did not mean that they were happy Christians or even that they had had much instruction in the religion. We can see this in the Saxon Stellinger rising of 841 and 842, a very large-scale revolt of the lower classes in Saxony, what the Annals of Xanten calls a revolt of slaves against their masters. As Eric Goldberg has pointed out, even in the 8th century Saxon missions, the Saxon elites were much more favorable to Christianity than the commons, who in the case of the English St. Lebwin, burned down the missionary's church, drove him away, and nearly lynched him. The Stellinger revolt was in part a reaction to the suppression of the free commoners' political role, as the Frankish rulers privileged the complacent Saxon nobility. But it was also specifically against Christianity. The Annales Bertiniani report that the rebels were men who had all but abandoned the Christian faith. The historian Nithard goes even further, telling that Louis the German feared that Norse, Slavs, and Saxons would unite to avenge themselves and root out the Christian religion in their area. As the Translatio Sancti Liborii, composed in about the year 836, reports, it was very difficult to keep the Saxon lower classes from reverting to paganism. In a land overrun with false Christians and well-meaning people who simply did not know the moral teachings of the new faith, there was a great deal of work to be done and few people to do it. There is precious little evidence of missionaries in Saxony after Charlemagne's conquest. One can hope that at least some bishops were concerned with evangelization, and there are slight hints of monastic activity. But it was a long time before a parish system was in place to provide instruction and oversight. And sure, somebody translated the gospel stories into Saxon, but did HEILIGE ever make it out of the monasteries and into the villages? Janet Nelson, again, I think, provides an important clue to understand what's going on. She reminds us that Carolingians were not actually much concerned with preaching to pagans, the outstanding exception being the scantily supported mission of St. Ansgar to the Danes and the Swedes. What did concern Carolingian ecclesiastics was the populus Christianus, people who had been baptized and had the name of Christian, but without the necessary education in the faith or moral underpinning. I would argue that LUDMILA's mission was precisely to such people, and that by becoming a recluse, she positioned herself in precisely the way that would attract and interest such people. The devil, we are told in her Vita, liked to torment the saint with stories of evil deeds Christians were doing, and pointed out with glee a breach of canon law that LUDMILA had herself committed. Like the powerful women exhorted by Jonas of Orleans, the recluse saw to the moral welfare of the people around her. For example, keeping the abbess's maid working so she couldn't go and meet up with her lover, or discovering through a vision that a woman's children had died because they had been conceived on Sundays. There was a lot of teaching the proper behavior of Christians that was going on out of LUDMILA's little window. Most specifically, LUDMILA was a teacher of girls and women. She was a skilled handcrafter, to the point that she actually allowed herself a fire in her cell, which is unusual for an ascetic, so that she could make dyes. And it is often just assumed that she was teaching dyeing or maybe embroidery to those she taught. But in both passages where the hagiographer brings up the issue, the subject of instruction is left vague. The author says LUDMILA instructed women who came to her. To be sure, the same section of the Vita speaks of her craft skills, but the same section also includes her prayers and meditations. Never is it stated that what she was teaching was crafts and nothing else. It would not have been strange to the Carolingian thought world to have a recluse provide spiritual education, as we can see from the first Vita of Saint Verena, which again is almost exactly contemporaneous with this Vita of LUDMILA. After Verena enclosed herself in a narrow cave, locals soon flocked to her, and she was recognized as a mother figure, specifically teaching piety to the young girls who gathered around her. The other reference to LUDMILA as a teacher of girls in the Vita is especially noteworthy. Archbishop Ansgar of Bremen, who honored recluses in general and had come to visit LUDMILA in particular, sent girls to our recluse. Were they just working on handcrafts? There is, in fact, a long Swedish oral tradition telling that LUDMILA and her students made altar cloths for St. Ansgar. But I can personally attest that there's lots of room for conversation when working on embroidery projects. And the Vita, in fact, says that LUDMILA taught the girls psalms as well as handiwork. More particularly, why was Ansgar involved in this, and where did he get the girls? LUDMILA was a recluse in the Diocese of Halberstadt, which was not in the Archdiocese of Bremen. The distance between where she lived and Bremen suggests how widely her fame had spread. Now, Ansgar was first and foremost a missionary to the Scandinavians. We know from the Vita Ansgarii that King Harold of Denmark gave Ansgar some of his own household to be educated, so that soon he had a school of a dozen or more boys. The bishop also started to buy both Danish and Slavic boys and train them for church service, keeping some close to him, sending others to a monastery. It would, of course, have been very improper for a bishop to keep a little harem of girls, though. He had girls. He sent them to LUDMILA. The girls Ansgar sent to her were of noble bearing, we are told. But they did not seem to have been completely free. After LUDMILA had taught them, we are told, she granted them their liberty and permitted them to go either to their relatives or wherever they wished. These girls were most likely the daughters of newly converted families, but may even have been purchased in the marketplace to receive a Christian education. By the time LUDMILA died in the 860s, Saxony was coming to resemble more closely a Christian land. Nobles were in fact busily founding monasteries and especially houses of canonesses, for which Saxony became very famous. But how many of these bastions of aristocratic prayer also supported a recluse or two? The sources fail us on this point. But to judge from the evidence further west in the German Empire and the familiarity with which reclusion was understood in the Vita LUDMILA, I would like to suggest that there were many, and that if anybody did, they were likely the ones who were playing the single most vital role in the conversion of Central Europe. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your contribution. It was certainly an interesting and I would say a very paradoxical story of a saint of a Christianized, half still a little bit pagan land, living a life in seclusion and both inside the society. So this is a really interesting story. So let me open the floor for the questions from the online or in the house. And if we, but I see Petra Melichar is raising her hand, so please.
Thank you very much, Professor Jestice. This was very interesting. I would just like to ask, do we have any information about why does LUDMILA choose this form of piety, or is there anything that like the Vita would tell about how she got this idea?
Unfortunately, we are given no hint of where she could have even heard of reclusion. The Vita says it's for penitence, but of course that's a very common topos for any ascetic. You know, you adopt the ascetic life, you live a life of penitence, and I can't see anything in her life that suggested that she needed to actually repent for anything. So it's, as in the case of other recluses, we don't really get the explanation of why. The saint's life that's closest to this of a recluse is the first life of Saint Viborada, who was a recluse attached to St. Gallen, who was martyred in the year 909. And in her case too, she just wanted to live a life of utter devotion to God.
Yeah, because it would be very interesting to know how did like these ideas of like how to express one's piety in this particular way travel. Like, were there stories like which somehow traveled through the land, like from like the travelers, or like who actually carried these ideas? Yeah.
I'm hypothesizing. Frequently, hermits went on to become recluses, especially male hermits. It's rather hard for a female to become a hermit. And so I'm really just hypothesizing that it's likely that some hermits were making their way to the newly Christianized land, and that might have been the way the idea spread.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So, chance for other questions? Grzegorz Patz?
Yeah, thank you very much for this very interesting paper, and it will be rather a comment. I just want to because you focus our attention to recluses, which is very important, and I think when one read, for example, Timar, it is obvious that there was a full group of recluses. They are all around in Germany. Sorry, I maybe exaggerated a little bit, and it is quite interesting because if you look for our Central European perspective, which obviously was very much influenced by the Reich, they are not present at all. This is probably related with the lack of sources we have. But let me just share with you one thought I always had. There is this moment in Cosmas narrative when Ludmila, another Ludmila, yes, sister of Jestislav II, is mentioned, and she's called Deo Devota Famula, and it seems that she's not in the abbey. She's not the member in the monastery of St. George. And I always had the thought that maybe she could be a recluse. Of course, we can only guess because this description, the Devota Famula, it can really mean almost everything. Also, it means that she was a pious or that she was a nun. But you know, this is. I just wanted to mention that to point out, in fact, that we should maybe, even considering even that our sources are so limited in Central Europe, maybe we should look for recluses more deeply, I would say, inspired by your paper. Thank you.
There is a mention of a recluse who is actually, I believe, called Inclusus in Cosmos. Unfortunately, I didn't look up the citation. I just remembered it sort of at the last minute. It's a reference to, in the 11th century, a false recluse who gives false prophecies. And that there is a false recluse just, again, implies that there are some true recluses.
Yes, that's a really interesting question. I can just have one point to this question, that actually Saint Ludmila herself in the first hagiography is actually called Famula Dei instead of Saint or Beatissima Ludmila. She's called in this way. This could be maybe a reference to some sort of religious semi-devoted life she had as a holy widow, actually, because she was so much devoted in the Christian life. So this could be actually a reference to this. Still, we have plenty of time for discussion. If we have another question.
We of the afternoon session are very careful with our timing, I see.
Yes, but now we are in a different situation. If I may ask, do we have the reference of her actual Ludmila's origin? She's a member of some sort of noble family or a common origin?
Some fairly theoretical work has been done trying to reconstruct on prosopographical grounds, naming patterns. The argument has been made that her father was actually a count. I don't find that completely convincing. She must have been well born enough to have been placed in a convent, which is not where you find peasants. But the position she has in Gisela and Bernhardt's family, it's sort of adoptive daughter, and it's sort of steward, higher servant, which to my mind suggests something lower than being the daughter of a count.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I was meaning, thinking about the same direction, because least in general, I was taught that the members of the monasteries in the Carolingian and Saxon age were mostly members of noble families or of their surroundings. Of course, that this could be, for example, the members of the retinues of counts and dukes, as maybe similar cases in the Widukin's chronicle when the name of a particular warrior is mentioned, and later we occur the same name as an abbot of the monastery. So maybe still there was some sort of a rather open society in this way in comparison with the later Middle Ages, of course. So this is also a quite interesting topic to compare.
It would be much easier to decipher if the hagiographer had told us the name of her convent.
Yes. So the problem, as it is usual in early Middle Ages, that we have a certain lack of sources for the general picture. So do we have any other question?
Thank you very much, everyone.
Seems not. So once again, thank you, Phyllis, for your interesting contribution.